Thank you. In the first week of January this year, a new fashion trend for young women was born on TikTok. The mob wife aesthetic, they called it. Clean girl is out, mob wife aesthetic is in, one TikToker orated into her iPhone camera. Glamour magazine opened their article about the trend stating, "Bye-bye stealth wealth, welcome to mob wife winter." They continue, "Anyone else getting sick of clean, quiet luxury? TikTok's so-called mob wife aesthetic, an explosion of animal prints, black leather, and all gold everything, is your excuse to go maximalist and a little messier this season. No organized crime necessary." Glamour continues that this trend is co-sponsored by the likes of Sofia Vergara, Dua Lipa, and Kendall Jenner. This article joins the ranks of those about trends that came before the mob wife costume age, namely the coastal grandma, the clean girl, coded luxury, just to name a few. If you've been on TikTok in the last few years, you've seen them. Notably, you can find these articles in shopping and style columns, and in each, you will find that they are uniformly complete, with hyperlinks to products you can purchase, from sweaters and bags to headphones and water bottles, that one can buy to neatly fit themselves into these mass marketed niches. For the right audiences, at least, the recent proliferation of these microtrends, as they've been called, has been both omnipresent to the point of normalization, and all the while seemingly inexplicable. So today, through the work of three philosophers, I will do my best to unpack this situation and situate it within an era in which we are all constantly surveilled and surveilling, in which we cater to invisible audiences on a daily basis, and in which tech platforms have successfully supplanted the state, redefining our relationships with ourselves and one another in the name of consumerism. All of these, I will ultimately argue, are part of our modern day reality, an aesthetic economy that lords over each and every one of us. Our first scholar is Susan Sontag, and among her wonderful repertoire of writing, she has penned two pieces which I feel are particularly salient to my talk today. The first, her book On Photography from 1977, and the second, her essay Looking at War from a 2002 issue of The New Yorker. In the former, Sontag argues that the proliferation of images at the time in print and on television led to the advent of what she calls the image world, in which the web of images becomes more real feeling than reality itself, creating a market to sell endless distraction and entertainment from the unjust conditions of capitalist society. The widely accessible and omnipresent means of capturing these images, too, becomes part of the equation, as both surveillance and images in everyday life makes public control and docility easier than it was in eras before photography and surveillance en masse. It was not until 2002, though, that Sontag was able to successfully capture the practical ramifications of an image world in contemporary society. In Looking at War, Sontag writes of the deployment of photography as a tool in political projects, and this piece is situated in the then ongoing national and military responses to 9/11 in New York City and the greater DC area. Now, this will seem irrelevant to and way heavier than the mob wife aesthetic, but if you walk with me for a second, you'll see how it's all connected, I promise. Sontag writes about war photography, sharing that when it was initially deployed in the early 20th century, it was used to show the public just how spectacular, violent, and gross war could be. Images of violence and hurt from war were in fact so powerful that the Nazi regime blocked the publication of a photo book showing exactly this. As Sontag shares, images in the context of war have the capacity to show how war evacuates, shatters, breaks apart, levels the built world, and thus not to be pained by these pictures, not to recoil from them, not to strive to abolish what causes this havoc, is a failure of imagination, of empathy. It just so happens that as the image world becomes ever so expansive and ever so saturated, these failures become inevitable too. These images, which once held so much gravity, so much capacity to bring joy or break hearts, have become banal, mere content in our feeds, pixels to fill empty bouts of time in our days. We have since become gluttonous for these images, and the means of delivery on morning papers, television screens, Instagram feeds, and TikTok For You pages are designed to satiate, at least temporarily, our unrelenting image glut. In the image world Sontag shares, image glut keeps attention light, mobile, indifferent to content. As Sontag wrote in 2002, the delivery in her case on television is designed such that one is supposed to switch channels, that it's normal to become restless, bored. Mind you, Sontag was writing this before Facebook, before Twitter, before Reddit, before TikTok, and still, though she wrote this 2 decades and some change ago, the phenomena of image and content glut feels more relevant now than ever before. Think of the mindless scrolls we do on our morning commutes, the passive playing of podcasts while working out, 24/7 news rendered ambient noise while cooking dinner. I personally am guilty of incorporating TikTok into my bedtime routine. We've all been there. It just so happens that as content becomes one of those quotidian noises in our days, it's rendered one of those stimulants that leads to the deadening of feeling in those days. So, what happens when we spend more time in the image world than in the real world? When the two become virtually indistinguishable? To explore this, our next philosopher, Jean Baudrillard, the postmodernist. Baudrillard published his Simulacra and Simulation in 1981, as reality television and 24/7 news broadcast became mainstays of Western culture. This graphic of the procession of the pumpkin spice latte is one of my favorites when it comes down to breaking Baudrillard's seminal simulacra concept. Here, in the first stage, a pumpkin. We're all pretty familiar with this, I hope. It's just a pumpkin, an image of a pumpkin. We know what it is. Still not super complicated, a pumpkin pie. We're fairly certain a pumpkin was involved in this production. A pumpkin should be in this pie. It gets more complicated, though, at the third stage, the pumpkin spice latte, a staple of American autumnal iconography. Was a pumpkin involved? Does it taste like a pumpkin pie? Does it taste like the idea of fall? As you can see, we're now relying on ideas of things as opposed to things themselves, a game of reference and derivation. Finally, at the fourth stage, the simulacrum, the pumpkin spiced latte flavored creamer. Tastes not like a pumpkin or a pumpkin pie, but instead like a pumpkin spice latte and all that might contain. Still, the two become conflatable, interchangeable within the imagination. And when we look at the pumpkin spice latte procession as an analogy for the image world and our modern day aesthetic economy, we may realize we currently exist among the fourth stage, what Baudrillard calls the hyperreal, or what Sontag calls the image world, in which we may not be able to distinguish what's real from what's pretending to be. In this case, the photos on the left are mere aesthetics, referencing and obscuring the truth, which is the consumption choices that we need to get us there. So let's return to the mob wife aesthetic and company. In the aesthetic economy, we must balance two conflicting truths. First, your aesthetic qualities represent who you truly are on some personal, political, or socioeconomic level. If you are a clean girl, your life is together. And if you are a coastal grandma, you definitely summer in the Hamptons, and you have access to so much generational wealth. Simultaneously, though, your aesthetic qualities, which again are who you really are, can be accomplished easily through a series of consumption choices. In the aesthetic economy, it matters not if your life is together, for here are 8 outfits you can wear, or 17 pieces of furniture you can purchase, and no one will know the difference. And if you're not privy to New England old money, you're in luck. You can buy an LL Bean tote or a pair of linen pants from Amazon. Your followers, they'll be none the wiser. With a few simple transactions, you can successfully put on your clean girl or coastal grandma or mob wife or coquette or Y2K costumes. Costumes which, due to the physical nature of posturing in the content age, is not just skin deep. Here emerges the new ontological crisis for our generation. A whole new identity is just an Amazon cart away. A sense of identity that is deep-seated, but loosely held, and in constant rotation. Because the aesthetic economy is in fact a market economy, we are all subject to the conveyor belt of market innovation, in which we are vectors for a constantly growing supply of products made to keep up with the pace of aesthetics and trend evolution online. Though Sontag said it about the news, the following can be said too for the aesthetics and the products they demand we consume. In the aesthetic economy, consumers droop. They need to be re-stimulated, jump-started again and again. It turns out that this act of perpetually reanimating consumer interest is incredibly lucrative. Whole industries are bolstered by such an aesthetic economy. Fast fashion, cosmetics, software, healthcare, just to name a few. There exists a whole commercial sector designed to prey on our increasingly public digital existence. generating frivolities and mass waste with each passing day. A present-day metaverse in which the body is no more than a billboard. However, we are still left with one final question today. Why is it the young people feel so compelled to constantly put on these costumes, to conform to these trends, and perform daily for their peers and strangers alike? To answer it, and to conclude the exploration of our present-day situation, our final philosopher, Michel Foucault. We will turn to surveillance societies and the ramifications they have on the public consciousness. In particular, let's talk about the panopticon. The panopticon originated as a prison model designed by the philosopher Jeremy Bentham in the 18th century. It was then expanded on by Foucault in the 70s in his book, Discipline and Punish. The panopticon as a physical structure is a circular building, which at its center features a watchtower that houses a watchman, and along its circumference houses all of its prisoners. The prisoners are hyper-aware of the omniscient gaze of the watchman in the watchtower. But the watchtower itself is opaque, rendering this gaze unidirectional, and its constant nature is independent of whether or not a watchman is even stationed in the watchtower. The implications of a panoptic system are that its pupils feel constantly surveilled, and therefore they behave with this audience in mind. As a result, they become their own watchmen, their own disciplinarians. In terms of social media, those who grew up on Instagram or Facebook or MySpace or Tumblr all grew up with a million watchmen around them at any moment in their lives. The clothes they wore, the food they ate, places they visited, and much more, all served an audience whose approval and consumption were paramount to social success. And in the influencer age, social success is just success. To be constantly surveilled in a panoptic environment is to feel constantly surveilled, and consequently, behave with this omniscient audience in mind. It's no surprise then that in the aesthetic economy, it's en vogue to be the main character. A world in which Snapchat, Facebook, your Photos app, Spotify, and hell, even TurboTax generate highlight reels designed to be shared with the public. As Megan Garber writes in The Atlantic, the new American dream is a life that gets optioned. This is the backdrop that affords the mob life aesthetic to pop up in our lives to begin with. A world in which we wear costumes in perpetuity is, of course, no more than a theatrical production, one whose success ultimately rests on appealing to audiences who we feel are watching us at any moment. A success that demands us to consume unrelentingly. This talk, which I realize is both packed with material and covers a breadth of ground, is based on a course I had the opportunity to teach last semester with a friend of mine, Bella Smith. It was a 13-week seminar geared for college freshmen starting their first semesters away from home, exploring their identities in a new environment. So I'll close this off by moving past the academics and the jargon, and sharing what we ultimately concluded in our seminar, which is that we exist in systems that are much bigger than us, and the easiest way to lose power in them is to fall into the trap of believing in true individual choice, true agency within them. Upon further inspection, your individual choice to participate in trends, to buy into aesthetics, to become vectors for commercialism diminishes. When I say that we live in the metaverse now, this is what I'm referring to. The increasingly blurry line between what's real and what's pretending to be. Organic versus manufactured. The privatization of the everyday. And the rendering of the self as but a cog in the unrelenting machine of capital. Earlier, I mentioned that these niches, those ridiculous aesthetics I've chosen to name today, are both hyper-specific and mass-marketed, a paradox. The large tech platforms behind our aesthetic economy rely on facades of individuality and an innocuous digital existence to obscure infrastructures of surveillance and commerce, to convince us that these grossly unnatural social relations are in fact normal and acceptable, to critically engage with the content we are constantly being fed, the products we are being sold and ourselves selling, to slow down and to realize that a wholly public existence under private control only feels normal because we've been conditioned to believe so, is how we can break off of the cycle, to leap off of the consumer conveyor belt we find ourselves on today. Thank you.